Right then, today we're diving deep into one of the most critical systems in the human body, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. You'll often hear it called the HPA axis. Now this is the sophisticated command chain that fundamentally governs our entire response to stress, whether that's a looming deadline or a genuine physical threat.
So, that leads us to a really fundamental question in biology, doesn't it? In a world that's constantly throwing challenges at us, everything from infections and injuries to deadlines and dangers, how on earth does the body maintain a stable internal environment? That state we call homeostasis. Well, the answer lies in the truly elegant architecture of the HPA axis.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with that challenge of homeostasis. Then we'll map out the neuroendocrine cascade itself. After that, we'll look at the role of its star player, cortisol. Then we get to the really clever part, the negative feedback loop. And finally, we'll look at what happens when this beautifully tuned system breaks.
Okay, so let's properly set the stage with this core challenge of homeostasis. To keep everything in balance, our bodies need a system that can 1. Sense a stressor, 2. Mount a coordinated response, and 3, and this is absolutely crucial, switch itself off once the threat has passed. This is precisely the job of the HPA axis.
So what is it really? At its heart, the HPA axis is a communication pathway, a neuroendocrine one to be specific. It links 3 key structures. First, the hypothalamus, which is a vital control center deep in the brain. Then there's the pituitary gland, the body's so-called master gland, sitting just below it. And finally, you have the adrenal glands, which are perched right on top of your kidneys. Together, they form this dynamic trio that regulates our response to stress.
So how does this communication actually work? Well, the system's brilliance is in its mechanism. It's a precise hormonal cascade. Think of it like a chain reaction, where one signal triggers the next, which triggers the next, ensuring a response that's both controlled and amplified.
It all kicks off the moment the hypothalamus perceives a stressor. First, it releases a hormone called CRH. Now, CRH travels a tiny distance to the pituitary gland and signals it to release a second hormone, ACTH, into the main bloodstream. ACTH then makes its way to the adrenal glands, and its message is simple: release the final hormone of the axis, cortisol.
Let's take a closer look at each of these messengers. First up is CRH, or corticotropin-releasing hormone. This is the initiator, the one that sounds the alarm. It's a peptide hormone, and it's produced by highly specialized neurons in the hypothalamus called parvocellular neurosecretory cells.
Now, the origin of ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, is actually quite fascinating. It's released from the anterior part of the pituitary, but it isn't made from scratch. Instead, it's actually cleaved, or cut, from a much larger precursor protein called pro-opiomelanocortin, or PMOC for short. And this little biochemical detail has some pretty major clinical implications, which we'll definitely come back to.
And that brings us to the end of the line, cortisol. This is a steroid hormone synthesized from cholesterol within the adrenal cortex. That's the outer layer of the adrenal glands. Cortisol is really the system's primary workhorse. It's the one that carries out all the changes our body needs to manage the stressor.
Right, so now we get to what cortisol actually does. As the master regulator, it has profound effects on almost every single tissue in the body. Its main job is to get the body ready for fight or flight by making sure essential resources are readily available.
This table gives a brilliant overview of its widespread actions. Let's walk through it. Metabolically, it cranks up glucose production in the liver. That's gluconeogenesis, while also breaking down protein in muscle and fat in adipose tissue to provide fuel. It's also a potent suppressor of the immune system, which is why it reduces inflammation. It even affects our bones by slowing down bone-building cells, and it acts directly on the brain to modulate our mood, our behavior, and our focus.
So how does one hormone manage all of this? Well, because cortisol is a lipophilic or fat-soluble steroid, it can slip right through a cell's membrane. Once inside, it binds to a special glucocorticoid receptor in the cytoplasm. This new complex then travels into the cell's nucleus, where it can directly bind to DNA and literally switch genes on or off. It fundamentally changes what the cell is doing.
Okay, we've established this incredibly powerful system for turning the stress response on. But just as important is the mechanism for turning it off. We need to prevent it from running out of control. And this is where the sheer genius of the system really shines through, in its negative feedback loop.
It's beautifully simple, really. The end product of the axis, cortisol, is also its own off switch. As cortisol levels rise in the blood, it feeds back to the brain. It acts on the hypothalamus to shut down CRH release, and it acts on the pituitary to reduce ACTH release. This effectively puts the brakes on its own production. And this feedback happens at a few key locations. As we said, cortisol acts directly on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. But interestingly, it also acts on the hippocampus, a part of the brain that's critical for memory and learning and which happens to be packed with glucocorticoid receptors. It plays a huge role in regulating the whole axis.
This slide really gets to the heart of a key question. Why does ACTH rise when cortisol is low? Well, when cortisol levels drop, that inhibitory brake is released. The hypothalamus and pituitary sense the drop, and they ramp up their output of CRH and ACTH to bring cortisol levels back to normal. And of course, the opposite is true. When cortisol is high, the brake is slammed on, shutting down CRH and ACTH production. It's a perfectly balanced, homeostatic mechanism.
So an acute stress response is adaptive. It's essential for survival. But what happens when the stressor isn't a lion you escape from, but a chronic, relentless pressure that never goes away? Well, under those conditions, this finely tuned axis can actually begin to break down, and that leads to dysregulation.
You see, chronic stress causes some really damaging changes. The axis stays switched on, leading to cortisol levels that are always high. Over time, the hypothalamus can become less sensitive to cortisol's off signal, meaning the brakes just don't work as well. The cortisol receptors themselves can change in number and function, and the whole system can essentially recalibrate to a new, dysfunctional normal.
And the consequences of this are severe and incredibly wide-ranging. We're talking about impaired immune function, which means more infections, metabolic problems like obesity, cardiovascular issues like high blood pressure, mental health conditions like anxiety and depression, and even a decrease in bone density. It really affects the whole body.
Now here's a fantastic clinical example that perfectly illustrates what happens when this feedback loop goes pathologically wrong. In a condition called Addison's disease, the adrenal glands are destroyed, so they just can't make cortisol. With no cortisol, there is zero negative feedback. As a result, the pituitary goes into overdrive, pumping out massive amounts of ACTH to try and stimulate the failing adrenals. Now, do you remember that ACTH is cut from that big precursor PMOC? While so is melanocyte-stimulating hormone, or MSH. So huge ACTH production also means huge MSH production. This overstimulates pigment cells in the skin, causing the classic hyperpigmentation seen in the condition. It's a striking clinical sign of a feedback loop gone haywire.
And this leaves us with a final and rather thought-provoking question. We've seen that the HPA axis is a masterful system designed for short-term survival. But in our modern world, the line between an adaptive response and a chronic, disease-causing state is becoming increasingly blurred. Understanding where that tipping point lies is, without a doubt, one of the biggest challenges in modern medicine. Thank you for joining me for this explainer.